Let's talk about types of bonds. So there are four main types of bonds, but the first one that we're going to talk about are covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are when two atoms share electrons. And it is the strongest form of interaction between two atoms. But there are two kinds of covalent bonds. There are polar covalent bonds and nonpolar covalent bonds. Polar covalent bonds are bonds in which atoms do not share electrons equally. So they share electrons unequally. And this is because one atom is more electronegative than the other atom. So let's take, for example, a water molecule. A water molecule has an oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, but the electrons of hydrogen are pulled closer to oxygen because oxygen is a more electronegative atom. Therefore, hydrogen will have a partial positive charge because its electrons are being pulled away from it, whereas oxygen will have a partial negative charge because it is pulling electrons closer to itself. And remember, electrons have a negative charge. Now, this is different from nonpolar covalent bonds, in which atoms do share electrons equally. And this is because both atoms in the interaction have similar or the same electronegativity. So some examples of this can be a bond between carbon and carbon atoms, or between carbon and hydrogen atoms, or between hydrogen and hydrogen atoms, or even between oxygen and oxygen, because those atoms in the bonds have the same electronegativities, so they're pulling the electrons with the same force. And so let's actually define electronegative, because we've mentioned this word twice. Electronegativity is the strength at which atoms hold electrons. So it is the ability of an atom to attract electrons. Now, electronegativity is different from polarity because polarity results from differences in electronegativity. So when atoms share electrons unequally because the two atoms have different electronegativities, they have partial charges, and that is polarity. But electronegativity is an atom's affinity for electrons, and polarity is the unequal sharing of electrons, or the partial charges that result from the unequal sharing of electrons due to differences in electronegativity. So you can think of polarity as something that arises because of differences in electronegativity. So for example, you can look at the water molecule on the bottom left, and we can see that a water molecule exhibits polarity because the oxygen atom is more electronegative than the hydrogen atom. Let's now look at the second type of bond, which is ionic bonds. So ionic bonds are when one atom gains electrons and the other atom loses electrons. So the atom that gains the electron is going to be called an anion. But the atom that loses electrons is going to be called a cation. And the way I like to remember this is that if an atom loses an electron, that means that they are losing a negative charge. So they are becoming more positive. And when you think of cation, think of the root cat. Cats have paws, and so positive is associated with cations. So an atom that is becoming more positive because it is losing electrons is called a cation. On the other hand, an atom that gains electrons is becoming more negative, so it is an anion. Another way to state this is that ionic bonds form between a highly electronegative atom that steals electrons from a less electronegative atom. So essentially, it's when an atom of high electronegativity is paired with an atom of lower electronegativity, which means that the atom that has high electronegativity pulls the electrons a lot harder. It has more affinity for electrons, so it's going to steal the electron from the other atom. Therefore, one atom is going to gain an electron and the other one is going to lose an electron. Now, one good example of a molecule that has ionic bonds is sodium chloride. Here we have a sodium atom that is going to donate its electron to a chlorine atom. So the chlorine atom is going to have a complete valence shell. And this is because these atoms are more stable when they are in this bond. So sodium is more stable when it gives away that one electron in its outer shell, and chlorine is more stable when it has a complete shell of electrons. So when the sodium atom loses its electron, it becomes a cation, so it has an Na+, and the chlorine atom gains an electron, so it becomes Cl-. It is an anion. And remember that these opposite charges are going to attract. So sodium chloride, which is salt, is going to form because of the attraction between these two ions. Now at room temperature, these are going to form a crystal because that is their most stable state. But when you place the ionic compounds in water, then the ions are going to dissolve or dissociate. So we will see Na+ ions and Cl- ions. And that is because in water, sodium chloride is at its lowest energy state if the ions are dissociated. And molecules always go to the lowest energy state because that is where they're most stable.